We're also on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and as of late also on Twitter. We are based in Berlin, Germany, and this event is part of our Green Library event series, and also of the Festival Offenes Neukölln. You can see a poster here. It's a festival this year only digital, so there are lots of events over the weekend for more solidarity in society. Our event is generously funded by the Berlin Senate. And for our Green Library series, we planned live events in a local bookshop, the Curious Fox bookshop here in Berlin-Neukölln, but we had to adapt to the current circumstances. And I'll be very honest with you, this is our first online event. I hope you will enjoy it. We understand if you don't want to show us your homes by keeping your cameras turned off, but to make this more like a real life event, we actually appreciate if you are willing to show us your faces. And also, as you can see, we are recording the event, but only those who speak will be visible, and that's myself and my guest, Jessica J. Lee. I muted everybody else, and I would kindly ask you to stay muted throughout. If you have any questions for Jessica, we invite you to write them into the chat during the event, and my colleague behind the scenes will collect the questions, and then we reserve some time at the end of the event to answer a selection of your questions. And also, if you want to give us some feedback throughout the event, please feel free to use the emojis, or just, if you have your videos on, you can also wave it at us instead of clapping. And now finally, I want to introduce our guest. Jessica J. Lee, we are so happy to have you here. Jessica is a British-Canadian-Taiwanese author, and she currently lives in Berlin. She holds a PhD in environmental history. From 2017 to 2018, she was a writer in residence at the Leibniz Institute for Freshwater Ecology. And Jessica's first book, Turning, which I have here, Turning, a Swimming Memoir, hope you can see it, was published in 2017. The German translation is titled Mein Jahr im Wasser. Yes. The second book followed last year, which is titled Two Trees Make a Forest, on memory, migration, and Taiwan. The German translation will be out in October with Mattes and Seitz, Zwei Bäume machen einen Wald. Jessica is also the founding editor of a literary journal, the Willowherb Review, and today we will talk about the two books as well as the Willowherb Review. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone from, I don't even know how many countries you guys just listed, but that's incredible, so thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I want to start with a few general questions concerning your writing style and the genre. And so both of your books are memoirs. You dwell on your own life, your family, love, and loss. And in both books, you connect your personal story with detailed explorations of nature and environmental changes. In Turning, which is set here in Berlin, you address the warming of lake water in recent years, and in Two Trees Make a Forest, you describe the high frequency of earthquakes in Taiwan, among many other things. So why did you decide to tell your personal story in connection to complex environmental issues?
I think it's one of those things that I probably didn't intentionally sort of, set out to do, but was a product of probably just many years of my life trajectory and my education and all of those things. Because I didn't go into my career as an academic originally thinking that I would become a writer in the end of it. And I don't think I really gave that a lot of thought at the outset. But when I did start writing, what came naturally to me was, I guess, to work with the languages I spoke well. And that was, partly environmental. My training was in looking at landscape and looking at history and landscape in particular. So that sort of made sense to me. And I found it really hard initially. Like, I'm not good at just writing about myself. If I can't make connections to other things, I don't really see the point of it. And so for me, it just, I don't know, it sort of came naturally as just a manifestation of the work that I'd been doing for a long time. But also moving away from sort of a more cold academic tone. Like, I didn't want to write like that either. I didn't want it to be clinical. So I think that's where the fusing of the two, sort of the personal and the environmental, comes together for me.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting. It becomes quite clear that your scholarly work inspires your creative writing in a way. I also wondered if your books were received differently in different parts of the world. And I'm thinking especially about the German-speaking context and the English-speaking context. And I'm asking because nature writing seems to have less of a tradition in Germany, and I wasn't even sure how to translate nature writing into German until I found the Naturkunden series by the publishing house Mattes and Seitz, which will publish the German translation of Two Trees.
Yeah, I think that sort of points to, I mean, even in German, and we should, I always think about the fact that the German nature writing prize that is run by Mattes and Seitz is called the Deutsche Nature Writing Prize, right? It's like we use the word nature writing even in German. And that is partly because, the tradition is not the same here as it might be in other regions. So in terms of the reception of my work, I think my first book, Turning, when it came out in Germany, was marketed as a travel book and was received as a travel book. But also I had the sense from readers and from reviews and that kind of stuff that it was like a travel book that puzzled people a little bit because it was so much personal and so much environmental content, if that makes sense. In the UK, I think it fits fairly neatly into a nature writing genre. And in Canada and North America, I mean, we'll see how Two Trees goes. It's not out yet. But I think, there's still a strong nature writing tradition there. But in Germany, there's almost never a point when I can talk about these books without having to also explain the genre and the tradition they draw on.
Yeah, I had the same impression. Before going into the content of your books, would you read from Turning for us, please?
Yes, I will read. So we've picked some passages. The passage I'm going to read from Turning is from, I think it's the second chapter. I didn't number the chapters in this book, so yes, it is the second chapter. So I'll just read for a few pages. There's a bay in central Ontario, 2 hours north of Toronto, in the heart of Canada's cottage country. It is a place of rock, water, and vast expanse. I swim there whenever I'm back in Canada, but for most of my childhood, I wouldn't swim in it at all. The depth and the darkness of the water kept me on the shore, terrified. The tangle of water milfoil in the shallows, to my mind, was a danger. Grasping hands of waterweed, clutching at my legs. It wasn't a place for swimming. But it was the land my parents chose. Both immigrants to Canada, they set about approximating the ideal life. My father arrived in the early 70s, carrying $20 in his pocket. He'd left school in Wales at 16, set off across Europe doing odd jobs until he boarded his first Boeing 747. He arrived to a tangle of Canadian suburban houses in need of renovation, so he became a traveling salesman, replacing aging clapboard and glass up and down the province. Within a decade, he was running his own business, hiring other salesmen like him. My mother arrived at 20 in 1974, speaking English only in fragments. Her credits from Secretarial College in Taiwan weren't recognized in Canada, so she was sent to complete grade 12 at her local high school. She spent the year out of place, longing for home. And then she married my father, an anchor in a foreign land. By the 1980s, our family was living in the Canadian suburbs, learning to be Canadian. My sister Nika and I were enrolled in primary school on weekdays, Chinese school on weekends, ice skating lessons, summer camp, ballet. We moved from one suburb to a nicer one. My father designed the logo for his home renovations business, a maple leaf to dot the I. We were sent for swimming lessons at the YMCA because swimming lessons seemed essential in a land full of water. Neither of my parents could swim.
Sorry, I muted him.
Am I good? Okay.
Yes.
Like my mother, we spoke Mandarin at first, but in time the words disappeared. We spoke only English at home. In school, they taught us French. Now, halfway across the world, as I've learned to speak German, I think of this, of the language I lost and those I've gained, of the places that have reshaped who I am and where I find home. I remember the sound of my mother walking through the door at the end of the day. 我回来了, one of the refrains in Mandarin that she repeated as if speaking to no one. I've always thought this meant I'm home, but I've learned that it means only I'm back or I've returned. But hui, return, the small box tucked safely within another box, is a kind of comfort. The origin of the character is in a spiral, referring to a kind of regularity, the rotation of coming and going. Home is the place you return to. From time to time, the words take shape in my mouth when I walk through my apartment door in Berlin, a kind of routine, the same way the patch of shoreline from which I swim represents safety. Fragments of Chinese slipping out between English and German as I press new words and places into place. Return. Home is as much in a language as it is in a landscape. The German word Landschaft implies a cultural landscape. It's built into the very idea. To speak about landscape in Germany is to speak of a place shaped by people, and given the past century's history, it hasn't always been easy to speak about. But agricultural fields, the romanticized places of forest and hillside, the many-storied rivers that traverse the country, all of these are cultural, on some level, shaped by and shaping culture. The name Berlin, so the story goes, stems from an old Slavic word for swamp. Hardly an attractive beginning, but it is an accurate name nonetheless. Berlin is built on wet ground. The Spree and Havel rivers slide across the city, damp cobbles edge the canals, groundwater rises from sandy soil. A ring of water surrounds Berlin, a speckled landscape of lakes. Fresh water rushes into former sand quarries, moorland slopes into marshland, rivers slip and swell across the flat ground. Brandenburg surrounds Berlin. A countryside at odds with the city, it is the place I least expected to love. Berliners joke about Brandenburg, its poverty, its backwardness, its bigotry. They ask if I've been given a hard time by neo-Nazis. They warn me that I'll have to improve my German skills if I'm to make it. All of this holds a grain of truth. But before any of that, I knew it for its water. To leave the city, to swim, you need to know Brandenburg. It's a place of summer afternoons, holiday homes, and forest trails. It's a place where silviculture thrives, where people farm and people live. It's a place that's made me stronger. Picture an eagle with its wings outstretched. That's Brandenburg. Berlin is at its heart. To know Berlin's landscape means to know Brandenburg's too. In 1862, Theodor Fontana, one of Germany's most celebrated 19th century realist writers, began to document his travels through the region. His 5-volume Rambles Through the March of Brandenburg took 27 years to complete and remains one of the most popular works of German travel writing. While the book has remained popular in Brandenburg, the relative inaccessibility of the landscape until 1989 has meant that the book has been somewhat overlooked amongst English speakers. It remains, however, a detailed and personal portrait of Brandenburg before the turn of the 20th century, mindful of its precariousness in the face of industrialization. From the forested, sparsely populated northwest of the region to the marshland at its east, his account speaks of a place grounded in water, a place that came to thrive through its aquatic prosperity. I began reading Fontana's Rambles when I moved to Berlin, translating passages from German in fragments, searching the text for lakes and towns I knew. His was a landscape shaped by storytelling and by memory. His was a Brandenburg untouched by the 20th century, layers beneath the place I've come to know. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. From what you just read to us, it becomes quite clear that your life has strongly been shaped by your parents' stories of migration, but also by your own relocations to different cities on different continents. And what you just read to us, or what stuck to my mind was the sentence, "Home is as much in language as it is in landscape." And yeah, can you maybe explain how you find home in landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes up as a question really often for me, this question of, you know, what I consider to be home or where I'm from. And it's always the most complicated question for me because it's never it's never one where I'll say, I'm from this town in this country and that was it. You know, I was born in London, Ontario, Canada, to two immigrant parents. And from there I moved multiple times. I've lived on 3 continents. You get that sort of feeling where it's like, okay, you know, I can't just sort of condense this into one thing. So for me, the sense of finding home in the landscape it's about memory and it's about repetition. And so I talk about this phrase, 我回来了, which means I've returned. And I think about it really often in terms of like having memories to come back to in a place, you know? And so when I first decided that I wanted to swim in lakes in Berlin, which was, you know, I swam in 52 over the course of a year, what I was trying to do in a way was sort of stretch over the landscape, right? To say like, I've cycled to this place, I know this place. So this is something that I can consider as known to me on some level. And obviously every place is far more complicated and vast and sort of can exceed that knowing, but that I might be able to return to places and you know, have a sense of familiarity. That for me has been sort of the most important component of a sense of home. So yeah, I'm one of those people that like obsessively likes to retrace going to the same places that I've been before, which is actually probably really annoying if you were to travel with me. If you ever went to somewhere I'd been, I'd just be like, I'm gonna go to all the same places again in the same order, just to see if I remember it, you know? And I'm a bit like that.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And this also kind of, yeah, I mean, this notion of home seems to say that home is something that you can expand when you move around, right? But at the same time, and that's returning to language especially, your understanding of home seems to be related to a sense of loss. And it became particularly clear when, so in what you just read to us, that when you said you learned Mandarin as a child and then in time the words disappeared and you spoke mostly English at home. Yeah, so how does language come into the whole picture?
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, it touches on this thing, you know, when I was writing Turning, and it was part of the reason why I ended up writing Two Trees Make a Forest right afterwards. It was a period of my life when I realized, I think, you know, my German got to a certain point and I realized it was better than my Mandarin had ever been. And that made me, I don't even know how to explain how upset that made me. Not that I didn't want to be speaking German, but it devastated me in a way because I realized that this thing that was, you know, the key to communicating with my grandparents on my mother's side, and, you know, even just to communicate with my mother in her own language, that I couldn't do it. And it was really upsetting to me. So I started thinking about language a lot more at that point, and I realized that for me, I drew enormous comfort from hearing Mandarin spoken because it was the language that my mother spoke to us when we were babies. And so even now, like I watch a lot of TV or I listen to music in Chinese, and it's really strange, but it's like, even if I don't understand what is being said, there's this part of me that feels soothed. which is, I think it's just the sort of familiar sounds, familiar tones, familiar words here and there. And so yeah, I think there's something in that. But I do also, I do sometimes feel very comfortable in German and sometimes very comfortable in other languages. And I found that a lot, we can talk about it later, but when I was in Taiwan working on my second book, there was a point after, I think, a month or two that I'd been there and I'd been speaking Mandarin and English only. And I met a German guy and I spoke to him in German and I was like, oh, this feels so different and good at the same time. So it's funny how they become a part of you.
Yeah, that's actually one of the passages that I kept remembering from your second book, and I mean that's also a very interesting aspect about your writing in general, because all the languages appear, right?
Yes, I think, I mean, I just never do anything in French basically because my French is like really bad school French. But yeah, English, German, and Chinese, I will confidently put in my books.
Yeah, so I guess we're slowly transitioning to your second book, Two Trees Make a Forest, and it's quite similar in style to Turning, and it also explores some of the similar themes, questions of home and belonging, but also and through place and language, but it is set in Taiwan. And before I ask you to read from it, can you tell us what inspired you to write the second book?
Yeah, I already mentioned the language component, which was a huge part of it, but so let me think. It was in 2016. In the autumn of 2016, my grandmother died on my mom's side, and it was, I mean, it had been a really long time coming. But she was someone with whom I think we all had a really troubled relationship. I think difficult is sort of like the generous and vague word I could use to describe our relationships with her. But after she passed away, my mother was cleaning out her house and she found a number of things, among them a letter that was written by my grandfather many years before. And he had already been dead for almost 10 years by that point. And when she opened it, she realized it was a memoir of his life. And he had written it as he was developing Alzheimer's. And so it was sort of this maze of a document that, looped around and repeated and wasn't always reliable, but sometimes was just crystal clear, telling his life story, which was incredibly remarkable. He'd, been born in China, became a flying tiger in the Chinese Air Force in the Second World War, and then had moved to Taiwan. And, he had a quite extraordinary life, which entangled him in sort of capital H history, like big world events in governments, in, the kind of stuff that you read about when you study history. And it was just sort of fascinating because it was stuff we had never known. So my mom, doing the thing that I think happens to every writer in every family, when something gets found, it's like you give that content to the writers always. That's what people do. They're like, we found this in the attic. This is for you. Go do something with it. And so she gave me the letter, the memoir, and I couldn't read it because it was written in Chinese. So that for me was one of those moments where I was like, I want to do something with this passionately and deeply, but I need to do a lot of learning in order to do it. And I had been trying for many years to write my grandparents' story, or what I knew of it at that point, which was not much. And I tried, like in my early 20s, I tried writing it as a novel, and that didn't happen. I'm not very good at fiction. I'm not good at making things up. And I'd sort of, put it in the metaphorical drawer of my hard drive and, not touched it for years. So yeah, this memoir came into my life, and I thought, okay, I need to do something with this, but I need to do it in a language that I speak, which for me is landscape. So that's how that was my way in.
Yeah, and would you now read to us from it?
I'm now realizing that I think the passage that we've picked for me to read, I think I actually just repeated the same sentence in both of my books. So we'll see how this goes. Languages become a home. In English, I find my mind, and in German, my present life in Berlin. But my earliest words in childhood were in Mandarin, my mother's tongue. I know them still. Go, lao hu, I, and especially po, grandmother, gong, grandfather. Puang Gong had moved from China, from homesteads no one had left in generations, to Taiwan, where they lived for nearly 4 decades, unable to return to the mainland. They arrived in the years after the Second World War, along with over 1 million other mainland Chinese, when Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government fled to Taiwan at the end of the Civil War. Taiwan had changed hands repeatedly. Though its indigenous inhabitants had lived there for thousands of years, the arrival of the Spanish and the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century spurred a continuous scramble for the island. The Dutch and Spanish both set up trading posts on the western shores and were succeeded by Chinese colonists who held the island for over 2 centuries. After the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan ruled the island from 1895 until 1945, when it was transferred back to the Chinese. When my grandparents arrived, the decades of cultural separation were an even greater gulf to cross. People like my grandparents and their descendants became known in Taiwan as Waishangren, literally people from outside the province, meaning mainlanders. A term so imprecise that even now I wonder how to explain our origins. Our history stretched across places imprecisely until our borders grew too hazy to define. Eventually, with my mother, my grandparents immigrated to Canada, where I was born. My grandfather, nearing his death, left Canada and returned to Taiwan. I grew older and then moved away myself, first to Britain, where my father is from, and then to Germany, where I made my life as a writer and academic. My mother, sister, and I stumbled over whether to call ourselves Chinese. We weren't from a China that exists any longer, or Taiwanese. No single word can contain the movements that carried our story across waters, across continents. Names are rarely uncomplicated markers. So often they're born from the snares of conquest, from the declarations and misunderstandings of those who sailed from foreign shores, from China, Japan, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands. Ilha Formosa, Portuguese for beautiful island. Taiyuan, an ethnonym taken from a local indigenous settlement. Ryukyu, the island arc of Okinawa, of which Taiwan marks a geologic end. Taiwan is rendered in script as Taiwan, can't read that, Tai for platform or terrace, Wan for bay, a foothold in a churning sea. Names here are buried and written over things, erupting from the ground underfoot the way faults emerge from a quake. Zhonghua Mingguo, Republic of China, as the country has officially been known since 1945. Or that incendiary marker, Taiwan, Province of China. Disruption is written in the island's stone, forged in movement, scattered with dormant volcanic hills, with slopes that rise from sea to sky so swiftly they cannot be captured in a single glance. It is a place that demands time and slow attention, but can be undone in a single moment of subterranean trembling. I was 18 when my grandfather forgot who I was. I was napping on the sofa at my grandparents' bungalow in Niagara Falls, waiting for my mother to drive us back home. I'd stayed in the bungalow 100 times before, on school holidays, at weekends, and when my parents would travel for work. Its thick orange carpeting was familiar underfoot. I knew the feel of its light switches in the darkness, where the edges of the smoked glass dining table protruded, and which of my childhood photographs belonged on which shelves. Mildewed stacks of Chinese newspapers dwelt in the corners, absorbing the polypropylene smell of the VHS tapes of Taiwanese soap operas that towered in the basement. I'd memorized the sounds and smells, the landscape scenes wrought in jade that my grandfather loved, and had helped to care for the bonsai tree he kept. I slept comfortably, curled into the summer stickiness of the black leather sofa, until Gong stood at my feet, pointed at me, and spoke in the only language he had left. Na shi shi. Who is that? Stop there.
Thank you. Since we already talked a lot about language and nature, I would now like to talk a little bit more about the historical context that you provided in this passage. So different colonizing forces tried to colonize Taiwan, and this also seems to entail discourses of like civilizing an outpost. And yeah, I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the different colonial ventures in which Taiwan has been historically entangled, and be they European, Japanese, or Chinese, and in how far it matters that Taiwan is an island.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things I will always say is that Taiwan is still a colonized space, and this is really important. People like my grandparents' generation, the Waishengren, who came, you know, when Taiwan was handed back to the Chinese government in 1945, it was handed back to the Republic of China. So the official name of Taiwan is still Republic of China. This is incredibly controversial. Still, and you know, it's really important. It's one of the things I write about in the book, was that my grandparents' generation was a colonizing generation in Taiwan, and that's, you know, quite important to underscore. Yeah, there, you know, Taiwan was one of those spaces through the 1600s in particular that, you know, it presented, I think, like a problem for a lot of sort of colonial explorers, in that it was very inaccessible on like half of the island. So the west coast of the island became the colonized side of the island. The rest was mountainous and full of cliffs and sort of impossible to work with. But it was, you know, just by the nature of its geography and what it had on the island, it was a space that was just really heavily, how do I put it, heavily sought after. So there were a lot of battles fought to, you know, gain hold of Taiwan. There's a really fantastic historian, Emma Jinhua Teng, who she works specifically on this period in Taiwan's history and visual culture. So she looks at maps and images and a lot of documents and colonial sort of travelogues of that time. But one of the things that I learned a lot from her writing was the importance of understanding in Taiwan, and how Taiwan helps us to understand a sense of colonialism that isn't just a Western European country colonizing, you know, a distant orientalized other, but rather that, you know, within Asia, you know, we have these sort of layers of colonization that happen within the region themselves, and, you know, understanding Japan's imperial efforts, but also China's. So yeah, I feel like it's one of those things that, like, understanding contemporary history in Taiwan, contemporary politics in Taiwan is so deeply connected to things that happened even hundreds of years ago. I don't know, it's one of those places where it's still so visible in a way. The second you start to sort of, you know, pick at the surface a little bit, it's a space that, you know, it hasn't been decolonized. So
yeah, that's very interesting. And throughout the book, you return to different aspects of colonialism, and one thing that I found fascinating also, that is related to European colonization, is that that you point to the connection of colonial endeavors and the classification of plants. I think at a later point you write, botany was made possible by local knowledge and labor. Can you maybe elaborate on that particular aspect of colonial practices?
yeah, so this is something that I think became really clear to me as a result of my language gaps, because a lot of the history of Taiwan, aside from what is, you know, written in English, was inaccessible to me. And when I wanted to learn a lot about colonial botany in Taiwan in particular, there's not a huge amount in English, actually. So the texts I turned to in the end, because I was able to really read them quite fluently, were colonial travelogues, which meant I sort of had that love-hate fascination of like, I want to know more, but I'm also sort of like, oh, that's a really racist thing to say all the time, you know, like that sort of dynamic playing out as I was doing the research. But one of the things that, you know, is really apparent in those texts, and some of them, you know, some of them have photographs, there's a whole, you know, they're very detailed accounts of this, is that access in particular to the mountains in Taiwan, and a sort of introduction to the plants, and to the sort of native ecology in Taiwan was, you know, was done by locals. None of whom got to actually name these plants, of course. They had their own names for them, But the official, taxonomy that we use now for speaking about a lot of Taiwanese plants, yeah, they're named after foreigners. They're named after, I mean, the worst one, I think, the worst offender is, so Yushan, the biggest mountain in Taiwan, the tallest mountain, used to be called Mount Morrison, and that was named for, there's two accounts, one of which is that it was named for like a Navy sailor, and one of which was like a merchant sailor, or like a religious, what do you call them? The people who go and spread religion, like a pilgrim. Missionary, yeah, there was like a missionary. So it's one of these two Morrisons that it was named after, neither of whom actually ever set foot on Taiwan. And every plant that grows in the region, I mean, not every, I'm exaggerating, but a lot of the plants that grow in the region of this mountain are named, Morrisonicola or Morrison something. And it's sort of wild to me when you really think about that, the power in that kind of naming from the period of sort of colonial botany and plant exploration. It's significant.
Yeah, and the perspective that gets invisibilized through this practice. Okay, so looking at the time, I want to move on to the Willowherb Review, which, as I said in the beginning, is a literary journal that you are a founding editor of. And so on your website, you say that the Willowherb Review aims to provide a digital platform to celebrate and bolster nature writing by emerging and established writers of color. And yeah, could you explain why it's so important to increase the visibility of nature writing by people of color?
Yeah, I think this is the thing, is like you just said about increasing visibility, because I think in the years before I founded the Willowherb, I had read like endless newspaper articles and sort of laments and Twitter complaints of people saying that there were no writers of color writing about nature, or that they couldn't find them, or whatever it was. And with the Willowherb, what I really wanted to sort of underscore was this sense that, like, actually these writers do exist. We have always existed. Perhaps you haven't been hearing us, but like that's through no fault of our own, right? And so, it was to sort of give that space some devoted oxygen, that, could allow writers to say, okay, I'm going to publish this piece here, and it will be seen by people looking specifically for this. And that for me was really important, because I was just tired of explaining. You get to a point where you're like, oh, you get tired of making lists for people of like, this should be your anti-racist reading list, this should be this or that, right? And so with the Willowherb, it was a way of banking that community and that knowledge in a way for people to say, like, for me to be able to say, you cannot say we're not here. You cannot say we're not trying. And so that was really important to me, because, the writers are there, and if people aren't reading them, like that's sort of their own fault at this point.
Yeah, and I think now I have two questions, because you have an open call right now, if I remember correctly, and also how can people support the work that you do?
Yeah, so our next deadline for the current call for submissions is the end of the month, June 30th. We publish Writers of Color on nature, place, and environment. Could be very broad. We have one writer writing about video games for this next issue, which I think is really exciting. It can be very broad. And let me think, how can you support? We're always open to financial contributions. We essentially, we're free to read. It's digital, it's online. It's important to me that it's free to read so that people do have this ability to access it. But simultaneously, we pay for all the work we publish. We pay writers, we pay editors who work with us. So we function solely on grants and donations. So if you go to our website, thewillowherbreview.com, there are details there on how to support us. But yeah, it's a work in progress. We're trying our best with it. So we'll see how it goes with this next issue. We're getting more submissions than ever before, so I'm already getting a bit nervous about choosing.
Yeah, I can imagine that that's quite difficult. We will also, I didn't say that in the beginning, but we'll make a transcript of this available afterwards. And yeah, things together as well. And now I would like to move on to the questions of
Big
our
question.
audience. I think we might not be able to answer all of them, but I thank you all so much for contributing so many interesting questions. And I mean, yeah, they are here in the chat, and we can all read them, but we have to select a few now. So let me see. Here are some questions on nature writing. How do you see the genre of nature writing altering as it recognizes new voices and diversities? What kind of, maybe that's one question now. How do you see the, or should I read more?
No, that's good. Yeah, I think I've got it here. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really exciting and I'm really optimistic about it. There's been a lot of negativity, I think, from people feeling like the genre was getting stagnant or stale. And I think to those people, I would always say like, well, you're clearly not looking in the right places. I think the genre is changing in the sense of like a new approach to the idea of who could be a nature writer, that we don't need to like be sort of rich white men who can like spend all of their time learning the name of every tree in a forest or whatever it is, you know, like that we can be a younger generation for one. I get really excited every time I see like a smartphone in a nature writing book, because I'm like, yes, let's be honest, we're not carrying like loads of paper maps under our arms. But also, you know, a diversity of perspectives, you know, writers who come to nature and landscape from a history of migration bring something completely different to the table. And they're sensitive to different things. And I think that's really important. One of the things, you know, that I thought about a lot very consciously with Two Trees and with the work that we published at the Willowherb is that so much nature writing tends to focus in the British context, it's nature writing is about Britain. And that is something that I will always sort of push against, because what we need to be able to do is understand that people with migration histories have different senses of home and of landscape and belonging, and we need to include those, which also helps us sort of upend this idea of travel writing as this sort of exoticized going to a foreign land thing, right? You have this sense of going somewhere in these kinds of texts where it's like, oh, actually, this is also home, and we can write about these places from that lens of belonging.
Thank you. And here's another question on language. Does language change how you look at or interact with landscape in English versus Mandarin versus German?
I mean, yes, in terms of like, it unpacks new layers for me. I really like learning the names of things in different languages. So the same item in different languages. But then I also realized that there are certain things that I only know the words for in certain languages. When I went to Taiwan with my mother, I realized I didn't know any of the plants, because when I studied botany during my doctorate, but it was like temperate plants. And so when I got to Taiwan, I was just like, I have no idea what anything is. And she would tell me the names of things, but she knew them only in Mandarin. And sometimes she would tell me the name and like literally translate it, and I'd Google that, and I was like, that's not a plant, like what are you talking about? And I'd have to get her to like write out the characters, and then I would search it, and it was like these multiple layers of translation. So that for me is like, it's a way of connecting also with my mother, which I really like. But yeah, here in Germany, this happened the other day. We were out, I was talking about a bird and I realized I only knew the name for it in German. And so there's like, that happens, or I could only remember the name in German. And there's little things like that come up sometimes.
Thanks. Okay, so here's a question on politics. It reads, I saw on Twitter that you started a reading group to combat anti-Black racism in nature and the outdoors. Can you tell us a bit more about this? And if landscape is a language, is there a possibility of addressing politics in a different way?
Yeah, so the reading group, I should say, this was, you know, I was speaking with a lot of other writers in particular, white writers, white nature writers in particular, who were saying they didn't really know what they could do beyond the sort of obvious things of like giving donations to this organization, and the sense of like, how do we actually change our small patch, our small industry in this way, came up a number of times. And, you know, being a white passing, half white, you know, person of color, but white passing very often, that for me was important, that like that space I can hold and work that I can do to facilitate something like that. So the idea of the reading group is to not have this kind of work of explaining what is, you know, what is racist in our nature writing and in our conservation and outdoors industry. I don't want that labor to fall on Black people in our industry. That's 100% not what should be happening. So yeah, I've assigned a book, and we're going to meet twice this month, and I've already prepped the questions for the first session. So I should say, it's like, if people think they're coming to like a cozy reading group, they're going to have a rude awakening. You know, it's going to be about processing, like learning from the books that we're reading and processing how that manifests in, you know, like in your own area, in your own life, in your work, and coming up with concrete solutions for how to challenge that. So hopefully it goes well. We'll see. It's Twitter, so I'm trying. I keep telling people not to share it anymore because I'm scared of us getting trolls at this point. But we'll see how we go. And then, yeah, if landscape is a language, addressing politics in a different way, I think there's just, if we can broaden our sense of the landscapes that we approach in our writing, as well as the languages we approach in our writing, there is a possibility for, I think, extending compassion and extending a sort of sense of inclusion to sort of multiplicities of things that I think, you know, and I mean this in terms of like, not just amongst humans, but, you know, amongst non-human nature as well. There's, you know, by looking at the world with this sort of attentiveness and this attention, not just in, you know, the same moor that everyone writes about, or not just the same mountain range that everyone wants to write about, if we can extend that much further and offer that same compassion to landscapes that are perhaps overlooked, I think it has an impact.
Thanks. And maybe as a last question, what kind of future do you envision for nature writing in the next years? And I would want to add to that, are you currently working on that future? Are you working on a new project?
So the future, I would say right now, the future is, I'm crazy excited about the future for nature writing right now. I will say, so I'm judging, I'm one of the judges on this year's Wainwright Prize, which is the UK Nature Writing Prize. It's like the biggest prize for nature writing in the UK. They asked me to judge this year. So, I mean, they invited me through the door. So if I kick up a fuss for any issues, you know, they invited me. But I will say today, as of today, they longlisted their first ever writer of color, which I will celebrate, and also think the first ever in 7 years of the prize. So that's Ginny Reddy's book, Wanderland. It's really exciting. There are a lot of writers coming down the pipeline who I just think are so exciting right now. Nina Mingya Powell's today posted that she had finished the first draft of her book that's, she won the Nan Shepherd Prize last year for this proposal. It's called Small Bodies of Water. It's a book of essays named after an essay that she wrote for the Willowherb Review in our first issue. So that's going to be a book, you know, next year. And just the amount I'm seeing, particularly in poetry, writers like Pratyusha, who just had a poetry collection called Bulbul Calling, which just came out. I mean, there's just so much I'm excited about, and that I get to meet and know a lot of these writers through our work with the Willowherb is like, it's kind of like being in a fan club, you know, like I'm just really excited about their work. So yes, be optimistic. And as for me, I am working on a new project. It's still very early days, so it's in the like, you know, bullet point list and sending some emails to people to see if, you know, it sounds like a reasonable idea stage. So I won't talk about it quite yet. But, you know, I'm excited at the idea of, I think, nature writing getting to a place where, as writers of color, we're also not just here to write about our identities. We're not just here to write about our heritage and our traumas or whatever that might be. So I will be writing a book that is like definitely not any of those things. where I will not repeat the sentence. Language has become a home, you know. So it'll be something different, but I'm excited about that.
That's so good to hear, and I think it's such a great note to end on. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you so much, Jessica, for being here and for telling us about your work. If you want to buy Jessica's books and you live in Berlin, we recommend that you buy them at the Curious Fox bookshop, where we would have done this event tonight. I mentioned in between that we will make a transcript of this event available on our website, poco.lit.com. We'll also translate it to German to make it available to a wider readership. And we would love to stay in touch with you all, so do connect on social media. We will also post our next event online, so you will all join again. It's called In Search of Better Skies, a reading and discussion with Jennifer Neal, and that will be on the 8th of July at 8 p.m.
Yeah, I should say Jennifer has also written for the Willowherb. She's Willowherb alum as well, and is an amazing writer. So
yeah, so we have
nature writing.
We hope to see you. We hope to see you then. And I think that's it for tonight. Thank you once again. I'll see you all off, and we'll end this meeting once you left.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Your friends.
Yeah. Good night, guys.
Okay, some people want to stay. All right. This might be the time to also.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
On July 8th.
Yes, great. And enjoy the rest of the evening.
Bye.
Bye.